Prince of Persia is something of a legacy series within the gaming community. Its first release being in 1989 on the Apple II, it garnered huge amounts of praise due to its expressive animations, its combat, and its overall adventurous feel. Since then, however, it's gone on to spawn a few remakes, a few sequels, a few spin-offs, and a few reboots to boot. Reboots to boot? Did I seriously write that? Moving on, most are familiar with those that came out on the PS2, going from Sands of Time all the way to The Two Thrones, spawning a movie based on the first game, and even a remaster is in the works. These, however, are not the games I wish to talk about today, nor do I intend to talk about the 16-bit era of Prince of Persia, although I'll touch on it a little bit. No, today I'm here to talk about the 2008 game that nobody ever mentions, appropriately titled Prince of Persia. This was the series' second attempt at a reboot, and clearly it was met with a few different reactions. While it promised to keep the staples of the previous games intact, the developers were pretty clear that there would be massive variations on them. What we got was a game that did a few things right, a few things wrong, and a few things subjectively, for lack of a better term. The game's premise is simple enough. You follow the adventures of a nameless protagonist who is partnered with a princess named Elika to save the world from an evil demon named Ahriman. Man, they should just hire me for blurbs at this point. You might think that's all there is to it, but there are a few interesting plot points to keep things interesting. Before that though, let's get into the mechanics of the game. Primarily set in an open world, your task is to bless the fertile grounds. Elika is the key to this, and so she is your companion throughout the entire game. The game consists primarily of platforming, exploration, and collection. Platforming in order to get where you need to go, exploration to determine where you need to go, and the collection of light seeds to increase your light power, which is then used to bless the fertile grounds. With each blessing comes a new boss, and there are 4 in total. Each one a soldier of Ahriman's will and designed to stop you in your tracks. Each one possessing different traits and using different tactics in order to achieve this end. The bosses themselves are pretty interesting in all honesty, and when you're fighting them you get the sense that they're more extreme versions of themselves. That in life they possess these characteristics, but in death they became more magnified. One example of this is the concubine boss. In life, she had manipulated her way to the higher rankings in politics, through her beauty and through her wicked manipulation tactics. Many were envious of this, and so she was beaten and maimed. Through Ahriman, she was given the ability to cast illusions and shapeshift, which in turn gave her power back, but at the cost of her soul. And now the extreme is using manipulation in order to deceive and obtain more power. All the bosses are like this. They have a backstory that explains their logical extremes. When it comes to the platforming, the developers seem to use a very experimental approach, focusing a great deal on cooperative technique over just simple platforming and running. Our protagonist is already agile enough, but couple that with Elika's abilities and suddenly you can reach further distances. For example, when jumping a gap, you can use Elika to bridge that gap. She will teleport, grab your hand, and hurl you towards the other end. But this style of play isn't restricted solely to the platforming, it also is prevalent in the combat. The combat. On one end, I enjoyed the return to the classic style of play, focusing on attacking, countering, and looking for openings. On paper this sounds fun, almost Dark Souls-ish, but the problem is each enemy runs on a more boss rush kind of mentality, meaning that unlike the previous Prince of Persias that came before, you're not surrounded by a group of enemies when you go into a battle. Quite the opposite, the enemies are kind of telegraphed in terms of their location, and you are only ever forced to fight in one-on-one conflicts. From a visual perspective it's very interesting, but from a mechanical perspective it's kind of the opposite. When I say Elika is involved in the combat mechanics, it's solely because some of the enemies are vulnerable to specific types of attacks. The aura color will change according to what attack you need to do. Coupled with that, the game also kind of tells you what you need to do within each combat circumstance, and in a way it kind of just holds your hand throughout each battle. Disappointing, but at the very least it gets the job done. It's also worth mentioning that due to this decision, you can't actually technically die in the game. Should you fall, should you die, should you lose a battle, Elika will go and resuscitate you, using her newly obtained magical abilities to do so. And again, this kind of removes any risk factor. It doesn't drive you to do better because she'll always bring you back, and will do so in the exact same spot that you were dying in. This is all subjective, but for me it just wasn't an ideal combat experience. The depth of play really comes from how you explore and how you platform across the various areas, using various abilities to reach different light seeds. At some point in the game, it does become a necessity to do so because you need a certain number of light seeds in order to carry out your blessing tasks. If your light power is insufficient, you then need to go off, find more light seeds, and become powerful in order to fight back. It can feel like padding, but the actual parkour mechanics are so fun that you kinda don't care. Story-wise, this isn't very deep until the end game. There are some moments between Elika and her father's ideologies and the choices that he made, certain things that are said throughout the game that make you think about what's going on, but overall the narrative is pretty cut and dry. Where the game really excels, however, is in its character interactions. Man, the character interactions. It feels as though each character has this natural chemistry with one another, bouncing off each other's words, coming back with smart-ass remarks, or even just some flirtatious banter. It's actually somewhat endearing. I found myself pretty much glued to the screen every time there was a character interaction. This was a strength of the previous games, but for some reason here, it just feels more natural, believable. It's worth mentioning that I played this game on PC, and so the epilogue chapter wasn't really available to me. However, from what I've heard, it does have a reputation of having ruined the original ending. So maybe it's best that I don't visit that, because I actually kind of like the ending of this game. I won't spoil exactly what it is, but it is a pretty daring ending. Prince of Persia 2008 is a bit of a mixed bag. Its platforming, its exploration technique is very ahead of its time. And if you're like me, you'll notice that within this game, some of this platforming was carried over to Assassin's Creed 2. For example, the character's ability to climb up a certain ledge and then leap jump to reach higher points is something we see later on in Assassin's Creed 2. It feels as though, in a way, this game was designed in order to test the limits of what parkour could do, and in a way that kind of makes it a glorified tech demo for such abilities. The mixture of the original Prince of Persia's and the Assassin's Creed style of parkour is ever present in this game, and I think that's where the depth really carries. Everything else is a tad bit subjective. I mean, you might indeed like the simplistic combat. You might enjoy the fact that the final boss isn't really a final boss, it's just a room full of mooks that you need to kill. Massive Quantum Break vibes. But if you stick around for it, the platforming and the character interactions are very deep indeed. Very much worth your time and attention. I don't know if I should recommend or not recommend this game, but by all means feel free to check it out if you have the time, if only to experience the experimental parkour and how it factors into later games. But for now, till next time.